Hello there, good morning. From ceasefire negotiations in Ukraine to trade tensions between the US and Canada. Today we delve into two major geopolitical developments. Russian President Vladimir Putin has responded to a US-backed ceasefire proposal, but insists that any agreement must address the root causes of the conflict. With high-stakes diplomacy unfolding, can a lasting peace be reached? Meanwhile, a trade dispute between the US and Canada is intensifying as tariffs and countermeasures take effect. With both sides digging in, what does this mean for one of the world's largest trading relationships? Let's get in focus.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
So let's start with Russia and Ukraine. As discussions continue over a possible 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin has outlined conditions that signal a firm stance on the negotiations. Putin has emphasized that any ceasefire must be part of a long-term solution rather than a temporary pause. His key demands include recognition of Russia's sovereignty over Crimea and 4 regions, Ukraine's neutrality with a commitment not to join NATO, and military limitations to ensure long-term stability. At the same time, the US and Ukraine have engaged in diplomatic discussions seeking common ground. However, uncertainties remain over whether both sides can bridge their differences. Will this ceasefire proposal be a pathway to peace, or is it another stage in the ongoing geopolitical struggle? The Financial Times reports that Vladimir Putin has welcomed discussions on a temporary ceasefire, but insists that negotiations must address what he calls the root causes of the conflict. His key conditions include territorial recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea and 4 other additional regions, security guarantees that Ukraine will remain neutral with no NATO presence east of Germany, and demilitarization measures restricting Ukraine's military to prevent further escalations. While some see this as a step toward diplomacy, others believe the terms could present challenges for Kyiv. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has described Putin's response as a promising step, but noted that negotiations remain incomplete. Could this be the start of a broader diplomatic shift? Now, joining us from Moscow is Rami El-Kalioubi. Thank you very much for being here with us on Qnews. So what do you think of this, the response by Russia about this ceasefire then?
Actually, Russia till the moment did not give any precise answer, and there is an impression that Russia tries to win some time, achieve more goals on the ground in the eastern Ukraine as well as in Kursk governor. And actually, President Vladimir Putin visited Kursk for the first time, and he was wearing military clothes, and which actually is a signal to the United States and to Ukraine and to the West that Russia, even if Russia accepts truce, but Russia will not accept that the West and Ukraine cross some red lines, and even that truce should not include Kursk or any territory recognized internationally as Russian. Also, this was not declared officially, but when we follow the media, pro-Kremlin media, they also suggest that there should be no unconditional truce, but truce should imply the beginning of conversations within a month, probably guarantees that Ukraine will not get any weapons during that truce, etc.
And Trump has suggested that there may be some territorial compromises on the table. He's just going to give Putin whatever he wants, isn't he?
Actually, Trump understands that Ukraine will never get to its borders as it was during 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, or even to 2022 when the war started. So, and now actually Trump understands, and he, as a businessman, he is a pragmatic man, that Russia will not withdraw from the territories which were joined to Russia in 2022, and that the maximum compromise that might be achieved is a ceasefire on the separation line.
Why should Russia be rewarded after invading a sovereign country and stealing its land?
Actually, Russia would answer and say that there were referendums organized on these territories, and actually the international law has a time bomb, as on one hand it guarantees the integrity of territories of states, but on the other hand it gives the peoples right of self-determination. And actually this controversy is resulted in dozens of wars around the world. And now, as we can learn from the lessons of Ukrainian war, that the present conflict is not the worst scenario, as is the case of northern Cyprus, where actually there is a ceasefire, and Nicosia is the only separated capital in the world today. But at the same time, it is not regulated.
And Ukraine has responded cautiously, expressing some concerns that a ceasefire could be used as a strategic pause. How do you see Kyiv's position?
Actually, the position of Kyiv is that officially Kyiv will never recognize that Russian presence in the eastern Ukraine, but Kyiv can accept it as something on the ground, and against getting some guarantees that Russia will not invade more territories, probably some security guarantees. But actually, if we go back 30 years ago, when Ukraine signed Budapest Memorandum and gave up its nuclear weapons, actually it did not prevent Russia from getting or from annexing Crimea in 2014, or from starting an open war in 2022. So actually there is a lack of confidence between all the parties, which impedes real truce and ceasefire.
Now, some people say that Russia's advances in the Kursk region have been a factor in the timing of these negotiations. What role does the military situation on the ground play in influencing the talks?
Actually, Russia considers that it has to be strong on the ground in order to be also strong in negotiations. And actually, Russia now is racing in a race with time to get more territories under its control in Kursk and in Ukraine as well.
Beyond Ukraine, there are discussions about US-Russia cooperation on energy, particularly regarding European gas suppliers. Does that play a role in the broader negotiations?
Of course, because in case if there is a regulation of Ukrainian crisis, some sanctions might be lifted from Russia, and this will open a door from American-Russian cooperation and also European-Russian cooperation. But at the moment, the European Union does not seem likely to lift any sanctions from Russia.
And if this ceasefire doesn't happen, if it doesn't materialize, where do we go from here?
Actually, this is a pessimistic scenario. This means that the war will continue. Thousands and dozens of thousands will be killed from both sides. The United States will have to impose more sanctions on Russia, so Russian economy will suffer more. But at the same time, it's self-sufficient now and is actually quite adopted with sanctions and will not collapse, and which means that the war will continue until the international situation changes again and would be ready for new negotiations under new conditions.
So what do you think then? Is it going to happen? Do we have the beginning of a breakthrough?
Actually, we can be cautiously optimistic because actually since end of March 2022, when the Istanbul negotiations failed, there was even no hints about soon truce or peace. But now the peace and the truce are on the agenda, and this is a positive signal for us.
Thank you very much for Rami Al-Qayyubi joining us there from Moscow. Thank you very much. Now, diplomatic efforts remain ongoing, but significant challenges and conditions must still be addressed before a resolution can take shape. While diplomacy is at play in Ukraine, economic tensions are rising between Washington and Ottawa in Canada. Trump's new tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminium have led to a sharp response from Canada, with retaliatory measures now in place. Could this impact North American trade relations in the long term?
Donald Trump is his name, and he's there to stay.
As unlikely, impossible is now reality.
America powerful. We will win, win, win. And we will make America great again.
Let's do our encourage.
We will very quickly make America great again.
The economic partnership between the United States and Canada is facing renewed strain as tariffs and counter-tariffs create fresh challenges for trade. Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminium have led to a swift response from Canada, with Ottawa imposing retaliatory tariffs of $30 billion worth of U.S. goods. With Quebec particularly affected, businesses on both sides of the border are bracing for economic impacts. Is this a short-term dispute, or could it signal a long-term shift in U.S.-Canada relations? Foreign policy reports that Trump's tariffs have directly impacted Canadian industries, particularly in Quebec, which supplies 60% of U.S. aluminium imports. Canada has responded with retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, including agricultural products and manufactured goods. Analysts warn that these tariffs could increase costs for U.S. consumers and businesses. Diplomatic tensions have also risen, with Trump's remarks about Canada's role in North America sparking controversy and further complicating relations. With both sides unwilling to back down, could this trade war have lasting consequences? Now, joining us to discuss this, Meher Nicolas Fursley, who is a former advisor to the World Bank and an expert in global trade policy, joining us from Paris. Welcome back to the program. Thanks for being there. So what do you make of Canada's tariffs, or the U.S. Tariffs on Canada, and Canada's retaliatory tariffs as well? What do you make of this?
Delighted to join you today. I think it's a very complicated issue because the two countries are joined at the hip geographically, and especially, I was going to say they can't survive without each other. One of the two cannot survive without the other, and that's Canada. So clearly, in that sort of tit for tat trade war, one player in that game is weaker than the other. But it doesn't prevent them from entering that sort of escalating war of words and burgeoning trade war. What was interesting, symbolically yesterday there was a G7 meeting of foreign ministers of G7 member states in the charming Québécois village of Charlevoix, and during that 24 hours sort of meeting, they used, diplomatic language, but they couldn't hide the tensions, right? And on the face of it, superficially, America seemed isolated, apart perhaps from Italy, but, putting aside Italy, 5 of the 6 G7 nations seemed to side with Canada. The Brits did that very politely and softly. So four, 4 of the 7 G7 nations, led by France, seemed to side squarely with Canada. The Italians and the Brits, politely neutral, and America alone, superb isolation. On the other hand, that's fairly superficial, I think, perspective, but that's something that was visible for us to see yesterday. More seriously, why is it not a balanced relationship? For a simple reason, is that Canada, so the Canadian economy, needs to do business with America much more than the other way around, right?
That's true, of course, and Quebec's aluminium industry is particularly hurting right now. But these tariffs could destabilize the entire region, couldn't they? And American consumers are going to feel the pain of this too, right?
Yes, indeed. You are absolutely right. So I think, what we call in economics game theory, right, is a fancy word, which means that we have mathematical sort of geometric models to visualize and plan the outcome of these games, or games of chicken, more colloquially. But to be honest, no one knows the future, because no one knows the outcome, because there are so many moving variables, moving targets happening at the same time. So that's the problem. So of course, if it becomes an all-out trade war, which is one possibility, so one avenue would be the all-out trade war, which was, hinted at not for long. Doug Ford, who's the prime minister of the one of the two, because the Canadian economy itself is based on 2 provinces. So 2 states account for 90% of the GDP. So it's about Quebec and Ontario, and the rest doesn't matter much. So the Prime Minister of Ontario is very powerful, and he tried the tough road 5 days ago with Trump, and he only lasted 24 hours. And what is the tough road? Is to tell to the Americans, you're very blunt with us. We are going to be brutal with you as a consequence. And Doug Ford said, okay, from now on, all the power, all the energy flowing from Ontario into American factories will be slapped an export tax. The White House was shocked and very angered. And the reaction of the White House was so brutal that poor Doug Ford had to backpedal 4 days ago. So he lasted 1 day in that avenue, which is one of the avenues open to Canada in the future, which is the all-out trade war. But that would be suicidal. Look what happened, to Doug Ford 5 days ago. So what I'm coming at is they will slap on each other in a ballet, in a choreographed ballet, incremental taxes to hurt each other, quote unquote, but it will be done within limit. So part of it, I think, will be theatrics. Of course, part of it will be real. And the hope is after 1-2 months of that game, they will reach a settlement. It's one avenue. So the rational outcome would be for Canada, to be honest, to make a few concessions. But so far, the Canadians and the Europeans don't want to go that route. So this is the route that the White House would like them to take in the next 1 or 2 months after being pressured. They don't want.
Well, one of the concessions that Donald Trump is really after is for Canada to become the 51st U.S. state. Now, it sounded like a joke at first, but people close to Donald Trump around him in the White House say he's obsessed with this and he's serious about it. The new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has said this is obviously never going to happen. But what do you make of this rhetoric about trying to take over the neighboring country and make it a part of the United States?
Well, you said the word, excuse my Greek. It is a rhetorical game. And the problem is, once again, to be fair, Trump can be brutal, abrasive. He can look disorganized. I think he's not, but the Trump White House can be perceived as being, quite disorganized and clumsy at times, and a bit brutal verbally, rhetorically. And so people, in Europe and Canada can be, faint-hearted, right? So they can be very sensitive, and they tend to overreact to Trump's theatrics, if you will. But to make a long story short, there's a logic to the madness. So there's something behind that brutal theatrical rhetorics. What does it mean? For Trump and for a new generation of American policy planners, to be honest and brutal, Europe, Britain, Canada are all irrelevant. Why are they sadly irrelevant to them? Because they are fiercely, extremely focused on new great game. So the new great game being, to make a long story short, the accelerating techno-industrial rivalry with China. And it's very focused on just three or four sectors or three or four issues, and high tech, deep tech, AI, and energy, of course, and the massive transportation infrastructure assets of the future. And these gigantic transport infra assets of the future, they will have to go through Canada, the North Pole, and Greenland. So it's one of the reasons why people make fun of Trump, say, oh, he's an imbecile, the Greenland and the North Pole. No, he's not an imbecile. In that rivalry with China, these gigantic, soon to be opened Arctic, trade routes will be crucial because transport infrastructure, the canals, same logic for the Panama Canal. Gigantic transport infrastructure cannot be in the hand of China. So these guys are brutal, yes, perhaps, but they're very focused on the fifth industrial revolution, which is another word for the techno-industrial race with China. And they came to the conclusion that Europe, Canada, Britain, it hurts our feelings, but are, quote unquote, to them, irrelevant. And it also explains why they are now changing tack on Russia.
Okay.
Because
Okay, well, let's just, because Canada now, of course, exploring new trading partners, including in Europe and Asia. Of course, Europe is doing pretty much the same. Isn't the result of this going to be that the United States, people will start turning away from the United States, and might actually, people across the world, countries across the world, might actually start turning towards China rather than towards the United States?
You're making an excellent point. I'm going to just divide your question in two parts. In geofinance or geoeconomics, the most important term is geo. Geo is much more important, geography, than finance and economics. And in Canada and Europe, they tend to forget that, to their great chagrin. Why? Because the Canadian economy was started as a British imperial economic project, and it was always built on a north-south axis. What does it mean? So Quebec's economy was right from the start, Montreal, Quebec, structured to do business with New Hampshire, Vermont, and upstate New York. Ontario's economy, right from the start, was completely structured to do business with Michigan and Illinois across the lakes. The Canadian made a mistake, being stingy, being very stingy and not very well at economic planning, unlike the Chinese, for example.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to cut you short, but we are just out of time. But I think we got the general idea. Thank you so much for joining us here on Q News. Meher Nicolas Fursley, who is a regular guest here, and always a pleasure to have you on. Now, from geopolitical negotiations in Ukraine to economic disputes in North America, today's episode highlights the key global tensions shaping 2025 so far. Will these ceasefire negotiations in Ukraine lead to a lasting peace? Can the US and Canada trade tensions be resolved before further escalation? We'll keep these developments in focus right here on Q News, and we'll update you all the time. See you next time.